We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The decision landed with the force of a family earthquake. In a private royal briefing, one name was placed above every other possible claimant: Prince Louis. Diana's most personal archive, letters, handwritten reflections, private recordings, photographs, and sealed family material, was to pass to him alone. For Meghan, the meaning was immediate and devastating. This was not merely an inheritance. It was a declaration about memory, bloodline, and who would carry Diana's private legacy forward. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan did not reach for the folder again. She pushed it across the table and asked why one child had been chosen above everyone else. The private archive, a protected collection of Diana's personal letters, recordings, photographs, and family writings, kept apart from public royal holdings, was now confirmed for Louis alone. That distinction mattered because this was not ceremonial property meant for display. It was intimate history, carrying memories no palace exhibition could soften or rewrite. William felt the shock differently. His son had inherited something priceless, yet the prince could see the burden hidden inside the honor. Louis had never asked to become guardian of a grandmother he never knew, and he was too young to understand why adults might someday fight over her words. The future king read the confirmation twice, lowered the page, and stayed silent. Across from him, Meghan watched his face and realized he was not celebrating. Then the restriction appeared. Louis would inherit the collection, but several sealed portions could not be opened immediately. The instructions required certain conditions before access was allowed, meaning ownership and freedom were not the same thing. A handwritten note attached to the file made the intention even harder to dismiss. The youngest child had not been selected by accident, convenience, or palace preference. Someone had chosen him deliberately. Meghan's frustration sharpened. She asked whether the decision could be reviewed, challenged, or widened to include other members of the family. No quick answer came. William looked again at the handwritten instruction, and the silence told her what the paperwork had not yet said plainly. Ordinary palace influence would not be enough to change this. The real mystery now moved beyond exclusion. Why Louis? Why not George, whose future was tied most closely to the crown? Why not Charlotte, who stood between her brothers in age and royal position? The answer had to lie somewhere deeper than rank. And once the palace began asking why Diana's private legacy had bypassed everyone else, attention turned toward the people whose futures had suddenly become entangled with one child's inheritance. Behind the explosive inheritance were people carrying very different wounds. Louis was too young to understand the full emotional history attached to Diana's name. William understood it painfully well. Catherine saw immediately what such a legacy could demand from her son. And Meghan saw something else. A door to Diana's private world had closed without her ever being allowed near the threshold. Suddenly, one archive exposed old grief, competing loyalties, and deeply personal expectations. Catherine felt the burden before Louis could even understand it existed. George had always carried the expectations attached to the direct line of succession, while Charlotte had grown up knowing her place would still carry public duty and royal attention. Louis stood differently. His position gave him more distance from the crown, meaning he was not expected to carry the monarchy's central constitutional responsibility, the formal duty of one day becoming sovereign and leading the institution. That distance had once looked like freedom. Now it looked like the very reason he had been chosen. William could not separate the archive from his own childhood. Diana's letters and recordings were not historical objects to him. They were pieces of a mother he had lost before he was old enough to ask every question he would later carry. The prince understood why those private materials mattered, but that knowledge made the decision harder, not easier. He knew exactly how powerful memory could become when grief remained unfinished. Catherine spoke to him privately once the first shock had faded. She worried that Louis might eventually believe he had been appointed to protect every secret, every pain, and every unresolved family wound connected to a grandmother he never met. She told William that an inheritance should never become an emotional sentence. He agreed, but neither of them yet understood why their youngest child had been selected so deliberately. Meghan carried a different hurt. Harry had spoken about his mother for years with deep emotion, and she saw his connection to Diana as one of the defining parts of his life. To her, the exclusion of their household felt painfully symbolic. It suggested that one side of the family had been kept outside the most intimate part of Diana's legacy. Yet the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the decision was not simply about who had been left out. Then William found Harry's name. The prince noticed it inside the archive instructions, but not beside the word heir. Instead, his brother's role had been placed inside a separate sealed provision, a protected instruction whose exact terms had not yet been disclosed. Catherine soon found another clue in an older family memorandum, a private written record used to preserve important decisions and reasoning. The language did not praise rank. It emphasized distance from the immediate struggle for the throne. Later that evening, William sat beside Louis and listened to him talk about an ordinary childhood concern, completely unaware that adults were already debating the meaning of his future. The contrast unsettled him. His son was still simply his son. And that left one question pressing harder than all the others. Who had first decided that distance from the crown, rather than closeness to it, made Louis the safest guardian? That search led backward to one forgotten family moment, when a seemingly private disagreement changed the destination of Diana's archive forever. Every inheritance this consequential has a beginning, and this one began long before Louis could understand his own place in the family. Buried beneath years of ceremony and carefully managed appearances was a specific private confrontation that altered the archive's future. It happened after a memorial discussion about Diana's personal effects, when a disagreement over access became so intense that one family advisor quietly recommended removing the collection from every adult rivalry entirely. William remembered how controlled the arrangement had once seemed. Diana's private papers had been divided across protected holdings, with no single household allowed to control her complete personal record. That layered family arrangement, a system where different people held different responsibilities over private material, had been created to prevent one branch from owning every letter, recording, and personal reflection. But as his relationship with Harry grew more strained, even that protection began to feel fragile. Harry had entered the memorial planning meeting already carrying years of frustration. He wanted future access to their mother's writings, shared equally between both brothers' households, not filtered through one side of the family. William resisted when the discussion expanded to spouses and outside advisors. The prince believed Diana's most private thoughts needed stronger boundaries. His brother heard something else entirely, another wall going up around the woman they had both lost. Then the room broke. Harry pushed back from the table and demanded to know why his own household should be treated like a threat. William answered more sharply than he later wished he had, insisting that grief could not become automatic authority over every private page. A chair scraped hard across the floor as his brother stood and walked out. One advisor remained behind and recorded the conclusion in a documented family account. If adult inheritance continued down that path, Diana's archive could become a permanent battlefield. William carried regret from that exchange, because he understood the anger had come from pain as much as control. Yet he never stopped believing the private material needed protection. Harry had wanted equality. The future king had wanted limits. Neither man realized that their argument would eventually reshape who could inherit the collection at all. Meghan felt the sting years later when she learned through the written archive history that this confrontation had influenced the final structure. She had not been in that room, yet its consequences now reached directly into her family. To her, exclusion felt like punishment inherited from a dispute she did not begin. That knowledge turned disappointment into something far more personal. Then the older memorandum changed everything. The revised instructions stated that the eventual custodian should remain within Diana's direct family line while standing outside the immediate adult struggle over her legacy. George was considered too closely tied to the crown. Charlotte was already linked to another intended group of family possessions. Suddenly, the logic narrowed toward one unexpected name: Louis. William remembered the scraping chair again, and this time the meaning was impossible to escape. One argument had created a path no one in that room could have imagined. And when Meghan understood that painful moment had helped place the archive in Louis's hands, she decided the paperwork was no longer enough. She wanted answers directly from William. The dispute stops being about old paperwork the moment two adults finally enter the same room and say aloud what years of resentment have kept buried. The confrontation comes without cameras, aides, or ceremonial protection. Meghan enters determined not to plead for property, but to challenge what she believes the decision says about Harry, her children, and their connection to Diana. William refuses to soften the truth. Louis was chosen precisely because the adults had made Diana's memory too contested. Within minutes, the conversation becomes something far deeper than inheritance. It becomes an argument over grief itself. Meghan had asked for the meeting because the documents left one wound untouched. Neither Harry nor their children held any automatic claim to inherit the archive, and she wanted to hear the reason from William himself. The prince agreed because silence would only deepen the rupture. He knew the conversation could turn bitter, but he also knew that leaving the decision unexplained would allow resentment to grow around Louis. Meghan spoke first. She told him the exclusion felt like an official judgment on Harry's side of the family, as though one branch had been pushed outside Diana's emotional legacy. Her anger was not only about ownership, it was about what ownership seemed to represent. If the archive carried private letters, recordings, and family memories, then being denied inheritance felt dangerously close to being denied belonging. William did not retreat. He told her Diana could not become territory divided between competing households. The future king argued that Louis had been selected precisely because the boy carried no adult political agenda and no personal campaign around his grandmother's memory. That mattered because the archive was supposed to survive the family's divisions, not become another weapon inside them. Then Meghan pressed the question that changed the room. If Louis had been chosen to escape adult rivalry, why did William still decide when the child could see the material? The prince answered carefully. He did not own the archive. He was only its temporary protector, meaning he could safeguard the collection during Louis' childhood, but could not rewrite who ultimately controlled it. The age restriction in the instructions fixed when his son could take full authority. Until then, William's power was protective, not permanent. Meghan leaned forward. "So Harry gets nothing?" William paused. He placed both hands flat on the table before answering. His brother did not receive ownership, he said, but something had been preserved separately for him inside the archive. The words altered the confrontation immediately. Meghan's anger did not disappear, but suspicion replaced certainty. If Harry had been deliberately included somewhere inside the structure, then the decision was more complicated than simple exclusion. William saw the change in her expression and understood the next question before she asked it. What exactly had been reserved for Harry, and who had the authority to keep it sealed? And as anger gives way to suspicion, everyone's attention shifts toward the legal structure powerful enough to keep even William from changing what happens next. Power inside the monarchy often looks absolute from the outside. Here, it is anything but. William can protect the archive, Charles can express concern, and palace advisors can debate consequences. But none of them can simply erase the inheritance and begin again. The decision has been locked behind a private family framework designed to survive precisely this kind of emotional pressure. For the first time, Meghan realizes the strongest person in the room may be someone who is no longer there. Charles read the inheritance memorandum alone and quickly understood the limits of his authority. The arrangement worked like a private family trust, meaning custody, access, and final ownership were deliberately separated, so no temporary guardian could simply claim the collection as their own. Louis remained the final beneficiary. Everyone else was there only to protect what had already been decided. For the king, that mattered, because even the crown could not casually override Diana's private wishes without tearing apart the very protections created around them. The monarch's concern was not legal power, it was his son's. Harry could see the decision as another rejection, while William was being placed in the impossible position of guarding Louis without appearing to control what belonged to him. The future king understood that every move would be watched. If he defended the arrangement too firmly, his brother might see triumph. If he appeared uncertain, others might push harder against the child. Then the memorandum tightened the boundaries further. Any attempt by an adult beneficiary, spouse, palace office, or outside representative to pressure Louis could trigger stronger restrictions around the archive. The clause was simple in purpose. The future heir could not be manipulated into sharing material before he was ready. That meant emotional pressure carried consequences just as real as any formal challenge. William read the next provision with equal care. Once Louis reached the required age, he would have the right to decide whether selected personal material could be shared with relatives. No family member could compel him. The prince felt both relief and unease. His son would eventually have freedom, but that freedom would come with choices capable of reopening old wounds. Charles reached the paragraph dealing with his grandchildren and stopped. He removed his glasses and left the paper untouched for several seconds. When an advisor finally asked whether he wanted to challenge the arrangement, the king answered quietly, "No. We protect the child." The decision was final in tone, even if the family emotions were not. Meghan now had her answer. The route through palace pressure was closed. Yet that protection created another danger no memorandum could control. If the public learned that Louis alone would inherit Diana's private archive, the youngest prince could become the center of a conflict he had never chosen. Once the palace chooses protection over reversal, the consequences begin immediately. And the first person forced to absorb the new reality is Harry. Harry had spent years speaking about Diana as the emotional center of his childhood, yet now her most private archive belonged to his nephew. The news was painful enough. The explanation cut deeper. This was not a victory for William over Harry, nor a reward for one household over another. It was the consequence of a decision built specifically to prevent either brother from owning their mother's private memory. For Harry, that realization was almost harder to confront. Harry received the formal explanation with Meghan beside him and read the central line again. Louis remained the sole eventual heir, while both brothers stood outside ultimate ownership. The notice also confirmed that his personal connection had not been erased. Controlled access meant he could privately review material directly connected to his childhood, correspondence, and relationship with Diana without gaining ownership of the full collection. That distinction mattered because the archive was separating personal memory from control. Anger came first. Harry asked why his own son had never been considered, if the goal was to keep Diana's legacy inside her direct family line. Meghan stayed close, sharing the sting behind the question. But when they reached the reasoning established after the old confrontation with William, both fell quiet. The arrangement had been designed after adults began fighting over access. Suddenly, The exclusion did not look like a new insult. It looked like the long shadow of an old argument. Harry felt that realization turn inward. One heated meeting, one chair pushed back, one angry departure had helped convince others that neither brother's household should ever control everything. He remembered wanting fairness. William had wanted boundaries. Now Louis carried the result of a conflict that began before the boy was even part of the conversation, and the weight of that connection was difficult to escape. Then one line stopped him completely. A sealed envelope inside the archive carried Harry's name. The custodians, the people formally responsible for protecting the collection until its future owner could take control, would allow him to read it privately, under the conditions already written into the arrangement. He could not remove it, copy it freely, or turn it into part of a wider claim. Meghan asked what the envelope contained. Harry sat down slowly. "I don't know." For once, he did not challenge the restriction. Meghan understood why. The envelope belonged to a relationship that existed before marriage, palace conflict, or public division. Diana's words to her son were being treated as something personal between them, not something automatically shared through a household. That boundary hurt, but it also proved Harry had not been erased. Now he faced a choice William could not make for him. He could keep fighting an inheritance no document would reverse, or he could confront the brother whose old argument had helped shape it. That choice leads to the quietest meeting in the entire crisis, and the one that changes its emotional direction completely. No lawyers sit between them, no spouses, no secretaries. For the first time since the inheritance exploded, William and Harry meet alone. Louis's name may have triggered the crisis, but both brothers now understand the real issue has always been older. Who has the right to protect Diana, remember her, speak for her, and decide what survives? In the silence before either man begins, the argument already feels less like a battle over property and more like unfinished grief. Harry had requested the meeting only after accepting that the archive could not simply be overturned. William agreed, but he set one condition before anything else was discussed. Louis could not become a symbol, a bargaining tool, or a target for anger that belonged to adults. The prince knew his son had already been given enough weight to carry. His brother understood the warning immediately, and for once, neither man challenged the boundary. Harry spoke with less anger than before. He admitted that hearing another child called the sole heir to Diana's private archive had made him feel as though his own place beside his mother had somehow been reduced. The words were difficult to say, because he knew ownership and love were not the same thing. Still, the pain had felt real. William listened without interrupting, and the future king finally understood that the deepest wound was not about documents. It was about belonging. William answered with a fear of his own. He did not want Louis to inherit two things at once: Diana's letters and recordings on one side, and the unresolved bitterness of her sons on the other. The prince told Harry that protecting the archive would mean nothing if their conflict became part of the inheritance. That mattered because the boy had been chosen to stand outside the adult struggle, not to become its next battlefield. Then William pushed the access confirmation across the table. He explained that he had already instructed the custodians to preserve Harry's personal rights exactly as written, even if relations between them collapsed again. The custodians were the people charged with protecting the collection until Louis could control it himself, and they were not permitted to reduce that access because of family tension. Harry did not pick up the paper. Instead, he looked across at his brother and said, "Don't let him inherit our fight." William answered without hesitation, "He won't." The silence that followed felt different. Harry then made the decision no one had expected him to make so quickly. He would not contest Louis's inheritance. He asked only that when the boy was old enough, someone tell him the truth. That adults had once struggled to protect Diana's memory without turning it into territory. William agreed. For the first time, the crisis had moved away from confrontation. But the calm belonged only to the family. Outside those walls, Louis's extraordinary role was about to become something much larger. By morning, what had been a private wound becomes a public symbol, and one image captures the entire country's fascination with Diana's youngest grandson. The story breaks beyond palace walls with astonishing speed. Suddenly, Louis is no longer discussed merely as William and Catherine's youngest child. He is being described as the future guardian of Diana's private memory. Newspapers debate the symbolism. Broadcasters dissect the family implications. Crowds gather where Diana's name still carries extraordinary emotional power. Yet behind every headline sits an uncomfortable truth. The person at the center of the storm is still just a child. Catherine feels that truth more sharply with every new headline. Palace communications. A controlled system used to explain royal decisions publicly without exposing private family material. Make one point clear. The archive will remain protected until Louis reaches the age set out in the existing instructions. And no private letters or recordings will be released now. That matters because public curiosity is growing faster than the boy's ability to understand why his name has suddenly become attached to Diana's legacy. Catherine refuses to let the attention reshape his life. She tells William that Louis must continue with the same routines, the same expectations, and the same freedom from adult conflict he had before the inheritance became public. The prince agrees. He knows his son was chosen partly because he stood away from the direct pressure surrounding the throne. Turning him into a symbol now would destroy the very protection the arrangement was meant to create. Meghan watches the conversation change as well. Only hours earlier, attention had focused on her exclusion and what it appeared to say about Harry's branch of the family. Now the debate is moving toward Louis himself. She understands the danger immediately. If she keeps pushing publicly, the dispute will no longer look like an argument over Diana's memory. It will look like adults placing pressure on a child. Then the meaning behind the choice begins to settle across the wider discussion. Commentators focus on Louis's unusual position, close enough to Diana's direct family line to inherit her private history, yet far enough from the immediate succession struggle to avoid carrying the same constitutional pressure as George. Harry's decision not to contest the arrangement also becomes known inside palace circles, cutting through expectations that another long family battle is about to begin. One fictional London newspaper captures the mood with a front page carrying 4 words: Diana's legacy goes to Louis. Beneath it sits a childhood photograph of the young prince. Near Kensington Palace, white roses begin appearing, and one handwritten card carries a simple message: protect the memories, protect the boy. Catherine hears about that message and goes quiet. Meghan does too. For different reasons, both women understand what the public has recognized before the family has fully accepted it. The inheritance is no longer only about who received Diana's archive. It is about whether the adults can protect the child who received it. And when the noise finally fades, one final decision transforms Louis's inheritance from a symbol of division into something far more meaningful. In the end, the most important decision is not that Louis inherits Diana's private archive. That part is already settled. The true verdict comes from what the adults decide to do with that reality. Meghan stops pushing for reversal. Harry refuses to challenge his nephew. William promises his son will never be burdened with the bitterness that preceded him. And Catherine draws one final boundary. Louis will grow up as a child first, and a custodian of history only when he is ready. William understands that the inheritance itself will not change. Louis remains the sole eventual heir, with full control delayed until the age and conditions already established around the collection. The prince remains only a temporary guardian, meaning his role is to protect the archive, rather than own or rewrite it. Harry keeps the personal access reserved for him, including the sealed material connected directly to his relationship with Diana. That separation finally gives both brothers something they had struggled to find before: a boundary between memory and possession. Meghan accepts the decision without pretending the pain has disappeared. She understands now that the arrangement was not created simply to humiliate her or erase Harry from Diana's story. Continuing the fight would only place Louis inside an adult conflict he never chose. That realization matters. The woman who had once pushed the folder away now steps back from the battle, not because every wound has healed, but because she refuses to make the youngest child carry it. Harry reaches a similar peace. His sealed material remains his alone to confront when the conditions allow it, and that proves something important to him. Louis inheriting the wider archive does not take Diana away from either son. The boy receives custody of her private history, while the emotional bond between mother and child remains deeply personal. For Harry, that distinction turns rejection into something closer to acceptance. William carries the final responsibility. He closes the archive file and puts it away, knowing that protecting papers will mean nothing if he fails to protect the person who will someday inherit them. Later, he hears Louis laughing elsewhere in the house and chooses not to return to the documents. Catherine looks at him, and the future king tells her there will be time for history later. For now, Louis gets to be Louis. That is the meaning the family finally accepts. Diana's private memory was placed with someone outside the immediate succession struggle, so that it could one day be approached as family history, not political ammunition. Meghan leaves wounded but no longer fighting. Harry leaves with his bond to his mother intact. William leaves understanding that custody is responsibility, not victory. Louis inherits the archive, but he does not inherit the feud. There is no further battle to tease, and no unfinished claim left hanging. The family accepts the boundary, and Diana's private legacy finally has a destination that does not require another generation to keep fighting over her memory. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.